Hi there, Chris here. Today I'm going to be working on binding my original Royal Courtyard quilt that I finally have quilted up, and I'm going to be making the binding completely with my AccuQuilt. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So this is the quilt all quilted up, and I chose to use this kind of coral color on the back. So I'm using the leftover bits of that fabric for the binding. Today I will be using the 2.5-inch strip cutter die board to cut my binding strips. You can also use the 2.25-inch die board if you prefer that size for your binding. Now the way AccuQuilt dies work is within this die board, there is a piece of wood with embedded steel blades in it. Those blades are stationary, and then there is this foam on top, one to protect yourself so you don't accidentally cut yourself on those very sharp blades. But then also on these shape dies, they use two colors of foam so you can see exactly where that shape is. So you add your fabric, add your mat, and as it runs through the machine, there are steel rollers that will press down, forcing the blades through that fabric. With the AccuQuilt Go dies, you can cut up to 6 layers of quilting cotton in one pass. So today I need a total of 9 strips. So we will just lay it on there, and we're going to fold it. And my piece is a little bit too short to fold it again. But I have another piece of fabric we're going to add on. So right now I have 4 layers of fabric. This fabric is folded in half from the bolt. So this is the total width of fabric folded in half. That's 2 layers of fabric, but it's going to give me 1 strip. So now I have 6 layers of fabric. And this particular die board cuts 3 strips at once across the width of the board. So that's going to give me 9 strips in one pass through the cutter. Now I have this extra fabric right here, and that's okay. All I'm going to do is fold it up so that it doesn't get caught in the machine as it runs through. I will make sure that the fold of my fabric is in line with this pre-printed line to make sure that it's 90 degrees to the blade. And now we'll take our cutting mat, lay that on top. And with the Go Big Electric, we just push it in. It will engage and grab the die from you. With the hand crank machine, you would just sit here and turn the handle until the die passed all the way through. So once the die has gone through, you can rub the cutting mat a little. That will help discharge any static electricity. And then slide off the cutting mat. And you'll see that it has perfectly cut your strips. This is our excess. We have just a little bit of waste here. And now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 strips perfectly cut, consistently 2.5 inches across. So this is enough to do the binding on my quilt. Now, traditionally, you would take these over to the machine, lay them at a 90-degree angle, and you would sew from this corner to this corner. Some people like to mark it and then sew it, pin it, all of that, and whatever you do is fine. But with the AccuQuilt, we have the advantage of being able to pre-cut, including clipping off the dog ears, to make that joining at 45 degrees just a little easier. So what you'll need to miter all of the corners is any half square triangle die that is larger than your strips. So our strips are cut at 2.5 inches, and this is a 3.5-inch cut half square triangle die. Then you'll also need the corresponding cutting mat for that die size. This die came out of the 6-inch cube system. This die actually came with the Go Big. So if this is the only die you have, you can use this as well. If you have the 6-inch by 12-inch die board, you will still want the 6 by 6-inch mat, and I'm going to show you why. So what we want is this angle and the little dog ear that's clipped off. And we want that on every end of our binding. So what we can do is take this binding, and we're going to line it up right with that blade. And we're going to go just past where that dog ear gets clipped off. Remember, we can do up to 6 layers, but we do want to unfold our binding strips because we want the 2 ends to have parallel cuts. And if we leave them folded, they would end up facing opposite directions. So we're going to lay 6 strips face up. Right in the same spot. We're just going to stack them very neatly. Now it's only going to cut where there's fabric and a cutting mat. So when we place our cutting mat on here, we actually want to offset it. There is a steel blade right here that is perpendicular. So if we put the mat on just like this, it's going to cut here, it's going to cut here, here. It's going to cut everywhere that there is a mat. What we want to do is offset it. It doesn't have to be by much, but we just want to make sure that the mat is not over this blade right here. We only want to cut the diagonal and the dog ear. So we can place it all the way up to here, but I'd like to make sure that it's supported, so I'll cover as much as possible without covering that last blade. So with this covered, we'll send it through the machine. Once it's done, we'll give it a little rub, slide it off. So it's cut off these triangles as well as these little bitty dog ears. And now when we go to sew these together, we will have a perfect 45-degree angle. And because the dog ears are clipped off, we don't have to worry about offsetting the seam at all. We can just line them up. And so from this point here to this point here. So let me cut the rest of these and then head over to the sewing machine. And since both of those angles are cut the same, everything's going to line up for us. So all we need to do is have one strip face up. We'll take our next strip face down. This is easier with print fabrics to tell which is which. When you're sewing solid fabrics, just make sure that all of your seams end up on the same side. So now we're going to sew from this point of the top fabric, so that very point right there, to this point on the bottom fabric. I also like to shorten my stitch length when sewing my binding, just so it's nice and strong. I have some diagonal seam tape on my machine, so I can keep that point in line with that. You can also use just regular masking tape, washi tape, whatever you have available, or some machines even have the marking come out to the bed. So that's all sewn up, and as you can see, we'll open it, and we have two perfectly straight edges. So I'm going to sew all of these pieces together, and then we will head back to the cutting table. For the next part, we're going to take our binding and we need to press it. So here I just have a wool pressing mat, my mini iron, and then we're going to use an empty thread spool to wind it onto just to help keep it managed. And to get it started, we'll need some washi tape, masking tape, painter's tape, whatever you got. Now, often I do not press my binding in half lengthwise before I sew it onto my quilt. As I'm attaching it to my quilt, after I go around the first time, I'm going to press it back, which will then press this in half. But with this quilt, I'm going to be trying a new product, which is some Fusible Thread. So I'm going to put this in my bobbin when I attach this, which means I'm not going to be able to press it back or I'd accidentally fuse the quilt to my ironing surface. So I am going to go ahead and pre-fold my binding in half. So I just start with a length of tape, stick some of that onto the fabric, and then wrap it around the spool. It can be a little tough to get started because the tape does not want to stick to the fabric very well. But once you get a couple layers, just the friction will hold it. What I typically do is I will press a bit, do some winding, press a bit, do some winding. And as I get to the seams where the pieces are joined, I want to press all of those open. We want to reduce as much bulk as possible in our binding. So having those seams pressed open will really help. Now we're ready to attach it to the quilt. And now that the binding is all ready to go, I'm ready to attach it to my quilt. For this quilt, I'm going to be trying out a new product to me, and it is Fusible Thread. I have used this in the past, but not for quilting. So what I've done is I've loaded up one of my bobbins with this fusible thread. I'm going to stitch the binding onto the quilt to the front of the quilt, and then I will fold it around to the back and fuse it in place before top stitching from the front again. So let's head over to the sewing machine, get this bobbin loaded, and stitch on the binding. So here's my setup for the binding. I have a second spool holder on my machine, so I'll just put it up there, and then as I need it, I'll pull it off, and it just dangles. But that way it's not on the floor, getting dirty, getting caught in the wheels of my chair. It just sits there. You can also just set it somewhere so that it's not in your way. So here's how I do my binding. I have already folded this in half and pressed it. Normally I don't do that, I just fold it in half as I go. But since we're using that fusible thread, like I explained earlier, I won't be able to press this back with an iron, so I just did that in advance. When I start, I'm going to leave about 10-ish inches unsewn. So we have just kind of a loose tail of binding. And now I'm going to attach my binding with a 1/4 inch seam all the way around the quilt. I usually just go a couple inches at a time and then readjust everything. There's a lot of weight with the main body of the quilt. I have a large table, but if you don't, you'll want to make sure to shift it around so it's not pulling where you're sewing. Now, as we approach the corners, we are going to want to stop a little shy of that. So right here at the edge, we want to stop a 1/4 inch shy of that. So what you can do is take a ruler. This is just a small ruler that has a nice 1/4 inch line. I can line that up with the edge of the quilt and then mark my binding right there. So I'm going to sew up to that point and then stop with my needle down. So with my needle down right on that mark, I'm going to lift my presser foot and pivot. So I sew off to the corner of the quilt at a 45-degree angle. And then cut our thread. Now we need to fold for our miters. And to do that, what we're going to do is take the binding and fold it back. It should create a 45-degree fold right here, and the raw edge of the binding and the raw edge of the quilt should be parallel. And now we're going to fold this back so that the raw edges are aligned right here. And this fold should be in line with the edge of the quilt. And these two folds of the binding should be in line with each other. So once you have that all in place and all lined up, then we're going to go and start sewing it again. Again, just at a 1/4 inch. And I'll back up. So you can be all the way off of the quilt there, and then just sew your 1/4 inch. I'll adjust the quilt so it's comfortable to sew, and then just sew down the next side. So we're at the next corner. I'm going to stop and mark that 1/4 inch, and it's a 1/4 inch from the edge of the quilt. Just mark that on the binding. And that's where we will stop with our needle down. Pivot the quilt and sew off at 45 degrees right off that corner, and cut the thread. And we'll follow the same steps as the last corner. So we'll take that binding and fold it off to the right so that we have our 45-degree fold and the raw edges are all in line. And we fold it back on itself so that the raw edges are all lined up with each other. And this fold is lined up with this raw edge, and these two folds are laying right on top of each other. So that looks good. Hold that in place. Stitch it down. Now, as we approach the area where we started sewing, right here, we want to stop 10 to 12 inches shy. Get this all in camera. So I have about 12 inches between where I started and where I'm ending. This is where we're going to join our strips. So what I will do is take my starting strip, and at about the halfway point, I'll fold that strip back on itself, and that's going to create a 90-degree fold right here. That helps you get a nice, clean 90-degree cut when you go to snip this. So you just insert your scissors and snip. Now you have a nice 90 degrees. Now don't throw that scrap away. This is going to be our measuring guide. So I'll open it up, and these are the two parallel edges. And I'm going to make one of those edges line up with this cut edge we just made, and then take that ending tail and lay it down on top. And you want everything to be nice and flat. You're not pulling, you're not tugging, and there's no extra fabric. So we're going to lay that down and then fold it back on itself so that that fold lines up with the bottom raw edge of that scrap piece. We'll insert our scissors and snip. Now we can get rid of that piece and that piece. So ultimately, your binding should overlap the same width of your binding. In this case, it's 2.5 inches. If you had 2.25 inches, it would be that. But the easiest way to get your measurement is just to use that scrap binding. That way you're ensured it's correct. Now, the reason we have an overlap is we're not just going to sew these straight together, because that would give us a bulky seam. We're going to join them in the 45, just like we did all of the other seams. But since we don't have the ability to run this through our AccuQuilt to miter those edges, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the starting tail and open it up and place it off to the right of the quilt, right side up. Now we're going to take that ending tail and we're going to open it up and place it perpendicular on the starting tail. So it looks like that. So we have it coming down, right side down, and then this one is right side up. Now it can be a little awkward trying to get them lined up. So one thing you can do, all of this unsewn area, take it and fold it. And then you can grab a binding clip just so that it is out of the way and it's not tugging on your pieces while you're doing this. So let's start that over. So once you've got your bulk contained, we're going to take our starting tail, open it up. So we're grabbing the underside and pulling it off to the left and laying that off to the right of the quilt. Now we have our ending tail. This is the raw edge. We're going to grab the top side and fold it over. So we have the right side down. And we are going to line them up with each other so they are perpendicular. If you're not a pinner, you will want to pin here. It makes it so much easier. We're just going to use 2 pins. Pop one in right there. And one right here. The pins should be running parallel to your quilt edge because we are going to sew in between them. Now what we're going to sew is from this point right there on the underside to this point right here on the upper one. All right, we have that seam sewn. So we'll take our pins out and we'll take this clip off. And before we trim anything, open up your quilt and lay your binding down. It should lay perfectly flat. No twists. We don't have any excess binding or excess quilt, like everything lines up like it should. And then once you've confirmed that, we can trim it. It is always best to confirm it first before you make that permanent cut. Now we'll finger press this seam open. Want to reduce as much bulk as possible. And then we'll go back to where we stopped sewing and then just continue down with our 1/4 inch seam. And there we go. That seam is joined at a 45 degrees, just like all the others, so no one's really going to be able to tell where you stopped and started. So now that we have all of the binding attached, we'll take this back over to the ironing board. All right, we will be working from the back side of the quilt, because that's where the fusible thread is. And as I go, I'm just gonna kind of flip it over and do a finger press. And then I want to fuse it so it's just barely beyond that thread. So let's see how this works. All right, I've made it all the way around the quilt. So now I'm going to take it back to the sewing machine. I'm going to be stitching from the front side, and I'll be stitching just inside the fold here. In fusing that bobbin thread, I don't trust it to be structurally sound to keep that on. So I want to make sure that this is secured and the back is secured. So I'm going to go do that now. All right, I have my 1/4 inch foot back on because on the left side here, there's an 1/8 inch guide, and that's what I'm going to use to stitch this in place. So I'll be sewing from the front of the quilt, and I'll just follow that guide right along there. I do like to pull up my thread so I don't get a nest underneath. So I just switched out to my universal foot because I actually want to get even closer to the edge. And I've found with this foot, I can follow the inside of this toe to the edge and I get a really skinny seam, like maybe a 1/16 of an inch. So we'll try that. Yeah, I like that better. So when I get to a corner, I'm going to go just past that miter, just by a stitch, so that I could pivot and still be on the binding. And that way I catch all of that. And with that, the binding is complete. Now my thoughts on using the fusible thread for binding. Honestly, I would not recommend it. So it did not have as strong a hold as I thought it would when pressing it down. And once it's fused, it no longer has any structural stability as thread. So that first seam where we sewed it onto the front was virtually gone. So I had to sew slightly inside so it's visible from the front and visible from the back. Normally I would stitch in the ditch on the front so that it's invisible. That's one of the advantages of sewing to the front first and flipping around to the back. I did see someone comment in my unboxing video about using it on a serger to attach the binding, so I might try that, but for now I'd say it's a no-go. I do have some other fusible products I'm going to try, so stay tuned. On my next quilt, I'm going to try something different. Thanks for watching. See you next time.